Welcome to the Autism Central podcast, the home of real stories, honest conversations, and shared wisdom from England's National Autism Peer Education Programme. Here, we bring together autistic people and the people who love, support, and care for autistic people of all ages and backgrounds to explore every aspect of life. The National Autism Peer Education Programme is delivered by Anna Freud and commissioned by NHS England. Through education, coaching, and connection, we offer resources, group webinars, one-to-one peer support, and community events that centre lived experience and build real understanding. Our vision is a society where autistic people, their families, and those who support them are empowered, connected, and thriving. This is your space, your community, your podcast. Welcome to Autism Central. Joining me today in our first episode of Season 5 is Tumi, a British-born Nigerian with dyspraxia, who is the founder of the Black Dyspraxic, a platform dedicated to championing intersectionality within neurodiversity. A multi-award-winning advocate, Tumi has received the prestigious Mary Colley Award from the Dyspraxia Foundation and has been recognised as Dyspraxic Advocate of the Year by A2I. He is the author of the chapter Race and Neurodiversity, Understanding Intersectionality and Privilege, My Story, in Reimagining Race in Psychology. Tumi is also an accredited clean language coach and an associate with Genius Within, using coaching to empower neurodivergent individuals. Known for his advisory roles within organisations such as the Centre for Neurodiversity at Work and Neurodiversity in Business, he is a leading voice in driving inclusion and empowerment within neurodivergent communities. Wow, what a guest. Welcome to me. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much. I'm really grateful to be here, and the work that you're doing is really amazing. So it's an honor to be on this platform.
Thank you. Well, we're excited to hear from you, to learn about dyspraxia today. And that's really where I want to start, is what dyspraxia actually is. So for any listeners, whether they are parents, carers supporting an autistic person or an autistic person themselves, and they're not familiar with dyspraxia or what it actually means and how it shows up alongside autism in everyday life, how would you explain dyspraxia?
So I think the first thing is to make it clear that um, we call it dyspraxia in the UK, but the academic and the medical term, and globally, so like in Australia, Canada, they actually call it developmental coordination disorder. And there's a lot of argument in the dyspraxic community which terms people prefer, and that sometimes causes the confusion. So developmental coordination disorder and dyspraxia are terms used interchangeably, and I think sometimes, in terms of understanding, that's why developmental coordination disorder is quite useful, because from that um, um, definition, we understand that dyspraxia is characterized by challenges with coordination. So when we talk about coordination, we're talking about duties and challenges in your fine and gross motor skills. So fine motor skills, especially in children, could be tying shoelaces or the bins, or making sure that when you color in, you're coloring in within the lines, or making sure that your handwriting is presentable, or handling cutlery, anything to do with your fingers. They may struggle with like playing the piano or other musical instruments. So that's a challenge. But then we're also thinking about gross motor skills. So the ability to walk or run, your gait, your posture could be quite different from other people. Your gait, to the way you walk, and your stature could be slightly different. You may struggle with balance. People with dyspraxia uh, may not really enjoy PE and much rather be left alone for physical activity, just because they might find it challenging. Um, so that's that. But in addition to coordination, I mean, this is why some people prefer dyspraxia is because there are still things such as executive functioning difficulties or social interaction difficulties or challenges with time blindness and memory and organizing instructions in sequences. And some of those things challenges may co-occur or may be similar to different, like your ADHD and all. And this is sometimes when we get the overlap. But challenges, so I would say that the characterization of dyspraxia, where I was talking about coordination and motor difficulties, but it's beyond that as well.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful as a definition to explain. And with dyspraxia or the other definition, the DCD that you talked about, do both have to be present? So do you have to have the fine and gross motor skills present with also the other things that you talked about, like the executive functioning and some of the sequencing and all of those things? And what happens about diagnosis?
Oh, very good question. So, and you're gonna get technical here. So, with the official diagnosis, there are three things, and I may struggle to remember all of them, but we're thinking about the DSM 5 manual. And so to get the official diagnosis of this dyspraxia or DCD as it would call, it can't be done online or stuff. It's professional. So we're talking educational psychologist or maybe pediatrician. And what you need to show is that the challenges with coordination are lifelong and they affect quality of life. So, from growing up, but you have to also show that the challenges with coordination are not caused by any other condition. There are clinically other conditions, other forms of disability that cause challenges with coordination. And so that's why you need a clinician because you have to rule all of those out and say, yeah, this is challenges with coordination. And yeah, that's a good question. Does it have to be fine? Does it have to be gross? As you know, as with all neurodivergent conditions, it affects people differently. So some people it can be gross, some people it can be fine, some people it can be a combination of the two. So sometimes people that have dyspraxia struggle with sport, but there's a professional. I forgot his name now. There's a professional rugby player that has dyspraxia or I know dyspraxic PE teachers. Do you understand? So stereotypes and words and descriptions. It's not a one size fits all. I heard this for the first time from the Dyspraxic Foundation that once you've seen one dyspraxic, you've done just that. You've seen one dyspraxic, and I think that same principle can be applied to autism, ADHD, and things. Yeah.
Absolutely. And because dyspraxia is often described in terms of that motor coordination, there may be people listening then who don't think it affects them or don't think it affects their child. What are some of the less visible ways that it can impact people day to day?
Can I also go back to the is it etymology? If you look at the Latin, dyspraxia, praxia actually means action, and this is difficulty. So dyslexia, difficulties with words and stuff. You got dysgraphia. So that dys is highlighting that difficulty bit. So you can see from developmental coordination disorder and dyspraxia that coordination action piece is really from the onset. So yeah, it's definitely going to be associated. Now we're thinking about okay, subtly, how does that show up with autism? If you have a child, now I'm not gonna say all dyspraxic in the children don't like sport because I actually did enjoy sport. But if you have a child that is not really enjoying PE, or would just rather not, was constantly making an excuse, why they may not want to, that might be a classic sign of actually it's not because they're just trying is actually because, constantly bumping into things. So I haven't talked about spatial awareness, but spatial awareness and knowing where you are through time may be one. Um, if it took them longer to walk or crawling, walking, if that process took them slightly longer, that may be an example. Struggling with the knife and fork and just, that may be quite difficult. Or if you have a child that struggles to control their pitch, so volume, always shouting, and you're like, why are you shouting? We're right here. It may be a that they're just struggling to control volume. I still struggle with that to this day. In schools, if they wear school uniform, but they struggle to tie ties, or they would rather not tie ties, or always having their shoelaces undone, not because they can't tie it, but they find it really challenging, and it's always coming undone, and they just rather um use Velcro. Or if you look and they're just struggling with handwriting, sometimes as a dyspraxic, you may struggle with muscle tone and everything, especially in the wrist area. So holding a pen and making sure that it's tidy, maybe. And also other things, so forgetting homework or time blindness and not able to follow instructions that require a lot of steps. All these kind of things may require. And then when we're thinking about personal hygiene, with people that are slightly older, girls may struggle with makeup because again with the hand-eye coordination. I didn't really enjoy playing video games again because of the hand-eye coordination, typing. So a lot of people with dyspraxia may struggle with handwriting because of what we talked about, but also struggle with touch typing. So voice to teach would be voice to speech recognition would be helpful. And then we're gonna probably talk about solutions and supports later. Coloring in. So coloring in, sticking within the lines, making sure you can do this, fixing things. Yeah, I've mentioned quite a few, but I hope you get the picture.
Yeah, there's a lot there. And I'm thinking also about, you've talked a lot there about children and how it shows up, but thinking for adults as well, and particularly things that are non-visible. I often describe that it's like in my brain, I hit a brick wall. There's a certain, it just won't go any further when it comes to sequencing or following instructions or directions. And you try and find workarounds your entire life to get around these things, and other people wouldn't necessarily see that. They wouldn't see those struggles, and they wouldn't see what you have to do behind the scenes to overcome that. I often think as well, even just taking information, I struggle so much on social media because there's so much that I want to say, but I can't get what I want to say into a summarized version. I just can't do it. Um, so I end up writing a book.
You've described other things that we haven't even come across. So, and this may be the overlap with maybe dyslexia and stuff, but I struggled with reading growing up. Not that the words jumped around the page and stuff, but it just took me longer to process information reading, so I'm much rather audible. Really struggled with English structuring essays and putting things together. But again, I know dyspraxic style authors and like magazines and stuff. So again, it doesn't affect everybody. When we're going to adults, if you're likely to spillage, you spill things all the time or you break things. So I'm very clumsy. I can drop something. I can walk into something. I often make a joke that I trip over oxygen. People with dyslexia are probably people that have it's taken them 5 or 6 times to pass the driving test, for
Yeah,
example.
7 times. 7 times.
Yeah,
Went the
I'm
wrong way up a wrong way street.
I still need to drive. I still need to do that. That's a really common one actually.
Mm.
Struggling or navigating in space, so directions and things. So these are kind of things, or even struggling to eat eat neatly. So
Mm,
I struggle sometimes. Always make mess everywhere, and I'm in my 30s. Also, people with dyspraxia, are incredibly sensitive to touch and just sensitive to things. So, for example, when I need to go to the toilet, I really need to go. And do you understand? Or
mm.
just to, sometimes touching feels like, oh, ticklish and so. So, you're very, very sensitive to touch. But yeah, also because of that, the difference is people with dyslexia are more likely to have high mental health um, challenges, insecurities. A lot of these things can show up, but I think those kind of things, now you're delving into co-occurrences and how the interplay between dyspraxia and autism and ADHD and stuff, which may be rather confusing. So I try to provide examples, clear distinctions that you're like, okay, this is what the characterization of dyspraxia could look like. But it's a bit more complex and nuanced than that, as we were talking about before the podcast.
Yeah, and like you say, we're all unique, aren't we? As you
Yeah,
said at the beginning, 8 point however billion people in the world, and we are all unique, but there are some commonalities, aren't there,
yeah.
in certain conditions of how those commonalities might show up. And for those autistic people, parents, carers listening, what kinds of supports or adjustments do you think in your work, in your advocacy that you do to me, what can make a real difference for somebody who is dyspraxic?
Occupational therapy. So actually speaking to, or maybe a physiotherapist for bone structure and stuff, because muscle tone and posture can be difficult. But occupational therapy is really good. Just helping to um just how to do things and processes. So I really recommend occupational therapy if you can get it. Unfortunately, sometimes it's difficult to get that support through the NHS. Um, breaking then seek breaking down task into small chunks. So I want you to do A, and then once you do that, do B, and then do C. Setting reminders. But also, I want to stress that having dyspraxia doesn't mean you can't do sport or can't do coordination things. It just means that you might find it harder. But actually, with practice of one movement over and over again, those things come easier. So sometimes dyspraxia is not about not being able to do something. It's just that may require more practice. So I think that's important. Allowing your child to do things, even though they may find it coordination difficult or stuff, rather than protecting them and saying you can't do that because you find, actually allow them to engage in tasks that stretch them with coordination, because that's how you improve that muscle, develop that cerebellum. And yeah, so over time, I think those things are quite important. But they can be other things. So using devices that are just easier. So, for example, using bigger scissors, or if you know that your child struggles to paint, to draw within the lines. I always used to love instead of drawing on like an A5 or A4, you having like an A3, large pieces of paper and large crayons and stuff. Just make things adaptable, but also I can't give you a prescriptive list because it's always different from other people. But what helped me was different things. So when I was younger, I had a wobble board, I had a beanbag, just practicing throwing the beanbag in the air and catching it and balancing on the wobble board for like a minute or two. And those things, they may sound quite odd, but they were coordination exercises and just things to just get me into the routine and stuff. Yeah.
And what helped you most growing up, to me? I mean, we haven't talked about your own experience of dyspraxia and at what stage you discovered it, at what stage you were diagnosed. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
So I was actually diagnosed at the age of 4, which is really early, but I often say that that was probably because my dyslexia was so clear. so clear. I mean, when you're diagnosed so early, the concept of masking and everything like that wasn't something I did. I often say that I knew that I was black before I knew I was dyspraxic before I knew I was black. And what I mean by that is in the African Caribbean community, dancing and being in tune with rhythm, maybe at a church or a party, those are things that are very cultural to our experiences. But all of those things were not me. Most black boys play sport, football, basketball. Those are standard things that I enjoyed those things, but I wasn't great at those things, you know. Um, so, but having that meant that I had access to therapy and support and stuff all through the NHS, but that support was really helpful. Um, but also, I think that allowed my mum and dad, they told my mum and dad that I had above average intelligence. And so, but what I would benefit from was a sympathetic score. And because of that, my mum and dad actually was able to actually decide that I will go to private school, whether or benefit from smaller classes. So I went from private schools that were owned by local churches and stuff. Now I recognize that private school is a real privilege, and not a lot of people have that access. But I think it just goes to show that small class attention may be quite useful for that support. So getting that tutor again, this is privilege, and it's difficult because sometimes people say with this, if you have a child with dyslexia, the practice, so practicing to tie shoelaces, practicing to do things. But when you're a parent and you have to put food on the table and you're working 9 to 5 or you're doing shift work, it's exhausting to do all of that as well. So it's a real privilege for people to be full time parents and stuff. So we need to be really truthful and honest about that. And I think this is the piece about the socioeconomic tensions of how the prevalence or the challenges can compound with different people. Another thing that um, helped me, and I know this might be quite controversial, is there was an organization called DDAT, the Door Program, that helped with support and those recommended those exercises and the support. They tried to, I think the controversy was that in the media, there were claims about trying to cure different things. And, it wasn't that for me. But from what I know, this was around 13 to 14, and these were so some of the exercises were throwing a beanbag and being on the wobble board or following an eye track. And I was supposed to do it 10 minutes in the morning, 10 minutes at night. And my parents say that it actually worked. So my coordination got a lot better through that process in those 2 years. However, I'm not sure if it was a placebo effect. I'm not sure whether naturally, if I just did that by myself, I would have got there eventually. There wasn't a randomized control trial. So I'm a researcher as well. So it's very hard to tell to say. All I know is that program did try to get funded by the NHS and stuff, and they did not take it in. And we're talking about around 2006, 2007 time. There is an organization, there is a website that you might find useful, and it's called Watch Me Do This. And it was a website founded by created by researchers at Manchester Met for young people, especially kids that may struggle with dyspraxia. So, like for example, tying shoelaces or tying a bin bag. There's just short 4 5 minute clips of, I think it's a child or someone going through the task, really breaking it down, so someone can literally watch them do this and see what that looks like, if that makes sense.
There's a couple of things, yeah, a couple of things that I just want to come back on that you were talking about, and one was about the cultural context of dyspraxia for you, and getting your diagnosis at 4, and
Mm.
in it within the cultural context that you were talking about, of realizing that difference so early on. Can you think back to being a child? Can you remember feeling different to me to looking at people around you culturally and saying, well, that's not me.
Yeah, I can remember not only feeling different, but wanting to be like everybody else. My mom used to tell me, you're the brain, so just focus on brain studies, academics. But when you're 7, 8, 9, teenager, you don't want to be the brain. Just no, you want to have, if it's being recognized for your sporting ability, you want to be recognized for music or drama. The extracurricular activity thing just wasn't me. Now looking back, maybe that was a positive because the narrative for Black people is sport and creative art. So maybe I should be thankful that that wasn't for me. But back then, it was a real struggle. I also need to say that my mom is a pharmacist. My dad also, when they got, um, my dad also is a graduate, and the reason why I say that is because with my diagnosis, I grew up seeing, and again, we're talking about between the ages of between maybe 1999 to 2010. I remember seeing Amanda Kirby's books on Dyspraxia and like on the bookshelf. And so this is before Google, before Amazon. Having those books, they've done that, done the advocacy. That was really helpful. Do you understand what I'm saying? Traditionally, within the Black community, because I'm also a Christian person of faith, my parents could have been like, "Oh, you don't have dyspraxia. Let's just pray about it and just believe." But they didn't do that. Also think it's very helpful. Again, we talked about the privilege of having time and attention to spend with you. So my parents were not able to spend that time with me on a one-to-one on a daily basis. But making that decision for me to go to private school was a real game changer because those private schools they were changed, different formats. But I left mainstream education in year two, or year one. And I say mainstream, I mean state school provided. And up until GCSEs. So we're talking 10 years of difference. And so again, I consider myself extremely privileged. And this is why sometimes, and then when I go in there, but I will talk about it when I talk about intersectionality. A lot of the times people talk about multiple marginalizations, but I think actually it's more nuanced than that. Yes, I am the Black Dyspraxic, and there's intersections of race, but there's also privilege there and the socioeconomic status, and so when we talk about intersectionality, there's a privilege component and there's a marginalization component, and sometimes when we have conversations, we don't realize how nuanced it is.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for naming that and for talking about that because it is, and there will be people listening who sit within that nuance of that intersectionality of all of those different layers who are listening to this who don't have access to a private school or don't have access to an occupational therapist or who are on a waiting list and don't know where to turn to. You talked about the research. You said that you're a researcher and you're researching. Tell us a little bit more about what you're doing in your work.
Just a bit more about the access and the services, and I think it's really important to hammer this. We are in what I like to call the most unfortunate storm. And why I say that is, yes, neurodiversity and autism and ADHD, the awareness and the understanding and the appreciation and the diagnosis and all of that has increased exponentially in the last 5 or 6 years. Unfortunately, simultaneously, our public services have been decimated. Don't want to get too political, but austerity and all of those things. And what that means is people that don't have access to private education, private occupational therapy, all of those services that are there out there that are designed to support families that are neurodivergent can't. And there's a massive gap between the supply of resources that are needed and the demand. And I think that goes us quite nicely to the work that I'm doing because I'm a health economist. That's my research. And I'm fascinated by how do we create equitable ways to, to, to provide resources to meet that demand. Because I think there's a lot of people that talk about resources, what we need, but how do we support that? Who pays for it and why? How do we do this effectively? So I'm really fascinated about how do I apply health economics to neurodiversity. So my current research right now is before we look at the interventions, we need to have a good understanding about the problem, what the consequences are. So I'm actually doing a current study looking at the cost of dyspraxia to the UK. So we're looking at adults aged 18 to 40. And we're looking at, okay, what is the cost of dyspraxia to the individual, to family members, but also to society at large? But you don't need to have a formal diagnosis of dyspraxia. You could self-diagnose and you're still involved. And so when I talk about costs, I'm not just talking about the monetary cost, but also effects on quality of life, effects on education, employment. We're asking all of those questions, and we're trying to figure out, okay, to what to what extent do the employment outcomes of a dyspraxic differ to it, and the employment outcomes of someone that doesn't have dyspraxia at the age of 30. We've also asked questions about their race, their gender, co-occurrence, so whether they have co-occurrence. And what we're going to do is we can then quantitatively analyze that, okay, to what extent does co-occurrence impact the employment outcomes, for example? Or your sense of well-being, or and what's the cost, what how much do people actually use services like occupational therapy? So all of these things are trying to be captured in the study, and I'm really excited about it because I'm the co-PI of this project. I'm currently a research assistant, so to have been able to have that, to be able to have seen the process of designing a study to this point, I'm really excited. And we're currently doing recruitment, which is going really well. And so that's the current research. And the hope is just to build on that as a health economist and as an applied health researcher looking at systems, because I think that then goes to because we haven't talked about strengths yet, but I do see myself as a strategist, as a systems thing. I remember my dad actually telling me, yes, I loved coordination and I wanted to be not wanted to be a footballer, but I was interested in sport and stuff. But again, knowing how my brain works, my dad was like, actually, why don't you take up chess? And understanding my skill set, I was a big Manchester United fan. And he was like, well, there's many players. There's David Beckham, there's Ryan Giggs, but there's only one Alex Ferguson. Alex Ferguson doesn't use the football. It's not his coordination, but he uses his mind and his ability to communicate. And that understanding was a game changer. And I think sometimes one thing that can really help parents is know your child, know the strengths, and maybe find someone in society that resonates and they can look onto it. Be like, okay, I may not be like 95% of the people in my world, but there's this one person. And that was really good for me. And then I've seen beyond that okay, yes, they're amazing musicians and creative artists, but actually producers are a thing and directors are a thing, and there's people away from the camera or on the opposite side of the studio. Different brains do different things for the, but someone that's 6, 7, 8, 9, no one tells you about their things. So
It's so important, like you say, to focus on strengths, just as much as you focus on the struggles, and to have that understanding of how do you nurture those strengths then, and how do you accommodate and adapt for the struggles that you have. And you start to get this very spiky skill set, don't you? And we talk about spiky skill set in autism. We can apply that to dyspraxia as well. Of some of the things you touched on, driving tests. There, I always say that it took me 7 attempts to pass my driving test, and it was horrendous, and I couldn't take the instructions that the driver was giving me and coordinate what I needed to do at the same time. I remember one time going up a one-way street the wrong way because I couldn't take the instructions. But then you can do something if you absolutely draw to your strengths. Um, you can do something that somebody else might massively struggle with. So absolutely drawing to those strengths and working out what those strengths are and where the struggles are, supporting them. And you were talking about some really basic things about, breaking down tasks. I always work on the power of three, that if it's got more than three parts to something, yeah, my brain hits that wall and it just cannot do it. So
I love that.
yeah,
I
let's
love
just
that.
do. I wrote my book actually in 3 chapters. I just couldn't approach it thinking that there would be like 10, 12 chapters. I just had to write it in three. And I find that so. And I can say to people now, just tell me in 3 bullet points, or just give me 3 things, or ask me to come on a podcast and just give me 3 questions. Don't give me anything
Because
more.
you're owning it now. You're
Yeah, I
owning it.
am.
But also that going back to that cost and economic cost, some people may hear seven, you passed and 7 attempts. But people but me as an economist would be like, but for every test, there must have been extra lessons. So think about the amount of the cost, the financial cost of you to learn to drive than someone that doesn't have this structure. Like, so, if we're talking 7 attempts, and this might be a massive assumption because obviously the number of lessons may decrease over time, but it could be, if we're going to do the math, 7 times as more. Assumption probably a bit less, but that's the kind of cost that we like to talk that it's important to talk about, I believe, because there's a neurodivergent tax, if you like. Now, another thing we need to also talk about, and I love the fact that conversations are evolving with spiky profiles, with strengths and nuance and challenges. I think depending on where you are on social media and what conversation you're having, people go to the extremes. People like to go, oh yes, superpowers. People like to go, no, it's all about challenges. Don't forget. And the reality is, it's a bit of both, and it's a combination, and there's a wide spectrum. You know, there are specs, but even the specs have gradients. Do you understand? And what has happened again, thinking of the systems thinking is we live in a world where a lot of conversations are dominated or structured around the frameworks of the algorithm on social media, and irrespective of what um, platform you're using. But the issue with algorithms, they don't do nuance well. They don't do nuance. They don't do strengths and challenges and putting them all together. And even the best AI models still struggle with nuance. There's something about the human condition that needs that, to compute the fact that there's that 8 billion differences and strengths you can have strengths and challenges, and a human and one individual can have a multiple combinations of strengths and challenges, and that combination for everybody can be the extent, not just your strengths and challenges, but the extent to which you have strengths and challenges. It's that combination, if you got all those tasks, can be so unique because there's multiple variations. And I think in conversations it's hard for us to compete in conversations, especially online, when you're thinking about the 140 characters or that 3 minute video. It's very hard to deal with all of that nuance.
It's so hard, isn't it? To put all of that into something, like you say, that is summarized and can capture all of that, because it just can't. And I think this is why it's so important that the work that you do, the advocacy work that you do, the research that you're doing, I mean, that is really diving into it. It's the depth, isn't it, of what you're going into. But for anybody who's listening, who has always felt clumsy or disorganized or like things are harder, and you talked about this, about, you know, the shame that you internalize when you are known as the one whose body doesn't work in the way that other people's body does, or their coordination doesn't, or you're the clumsy one, or you're the kind of butt of people's jokes growing up. One of my earliest memories is walking into a lamppost. Walking down the street and walking into a lamppost.
I didn't talk about the bullying in this session, but it was horrendous. It was horrendous and said awful names that probably should not mention on this podcast. But yeah, because but are children mean? It's naturally mean. I don't think so. I just think children are they they find it difficult to deal with difference early, and they don't know how to deal with it. So as they're figuring out their insecurities and stuff, they can take it out on the most marginalized person. And because of being dyspraxic, I struggled to think on my feet or to put person in their place, you know. But bullying was a lot. In terms of what can you do to help, my mom always used to say this to me, that again, it's money, finances. And I know not everyone can do this. Try and use support systems or pay for the things that you find difficult. Say, for example, you may struggle with disorganization. The reality is, you're probably never going to be the most organized person. But guess what? PAs exist. You can employ someone to help you. Now, access to work. Now, I'm literally going to have a meeting with mine after. So, with access to work, I have a support worker. You know, there's now AI out there for writing and comprehension, and you know, now there's text, speech to text software where you speak and attack, and these tools are getting better and better and better. I compare these tools to Dragon in 2010, 2011. There's so much things out there. But in terms of another support that I really do believe the environment that you have children in is so important. It needs to be as positive as possible. I always say to people, never ever tell your child that they can't do anything if they want to do it. If they want to climb Mount Everest or go to the moon, a child needs to feel for their parents that they can do anything if they set their mind to it. And that might be hard to fathom given diagnosis of autism or dyspraxia, but you need to create that because they need that self esteem, that belief. Because at the end of the day, as a parent, you're their advocate. And if they can't get that belief from you, where are they going to get that in society? Not saying it's easy, but yeah.
Yeah. And that's a really good point to end this conversation on, actually, is about that, what you would want to say to anybody about what it means to live with dyspraxia, to anybody who completely underestimates it, anybody who maybe misunderstands it. Um, what myth would you want to bust? If you could, I know there's probably many, to me, but if you could really bust a myth to anybody listening, what would you want to say?
I think there's quite a few things. Number one, you don't grow out of it. So yes, things can come easier, but there's certain things that, in terms of the clumsiness and the speech, it just doesn't grow out of. Another myth is the characteristics and that we've talked about it. Um, I think sometimes, even though your child or your individual may be autistic, it's helpful to weed out, you know, okay, this is dyspraxia, and because of this is dyspraxia, I need dyspraxia specific support for this certain aspect, and sometimes that untangling it is very important. But it's funny because I think all the myths we've kind of talked about it. Okay, there's a common myth that it occurs more in boys than it does in girls. No, it doesn't discriminate, and I think that's really important as well. There's also a myth that it's not as prevalent compared to ADHD and autism. Again, that's a myth because we're talking. Recent papers talk about 1 in 20, 5% of the population, and that is actually quite prevalent in comparison to AD, similar prevalences, but people just don't talk about it less. And I think that's probably the biggest myth that we need to um, disintegrate and understand. And thinking about why is that, I think sometimes it's the being interchangeably with dyspraxia DCT gets rather confusing in literature and things. And because of 2 or 3 years ago, we no longer have a national charity. The Dyspraxia Foundation used to be that hub, but I think it closed in 2022, 2023, and since then. So dyspraxia is has an upward battle for raising that awareness, and that's another reason why I do what I do.
Why do you think that is, Tumi? Why do you think dyspraxia, I mean, not even having a charity to support it, why do you think that is? Why do you think dyspraxia doesn't get the airtime, the understanding that perhaps other conditions do?
That's a variety of reasons. I think the charity is a good one, but I think sometimes some neurodivergent differences, you need that one famous person to champion it. So with autism, uh, and again the stereotype, and you can talk about it more. It was that San Francisco tech bro with the money and Rayman, the movies, even the whole neurodiversity movement. You had people like the music singers and other people that were autistic, and they came with that noise and that lens, and that drives conversations. And we now talk about right now ADHD, it's that issue with medication and waiting lists, and how that intersects with prescribed medication and things like that. Um, it's different for dyspraxia, and I think these things happen in waves, and maybe the wave for dyspraxia is still coming. I think one of the most famous ones was actually a Doctor Who series where episode where the character did have dyspraxia, and there are celebrities like Daniel Radcliffe. He has dyspraxia, so it's coming out, but I'm not sure. Maybe I haven't really answered the question, but I also think that lack of consistency. Name me another neurodivergent trait or neurotype or difference that is one word in one country in the Anglosphere, or one word in the medical literature, but not another word in the other. So is it DCD, is it dyspraxia, or which is it? And when it comes to, especially in a world where there's SEO, search engine optimization, and libraries with papers and algorithms when you search, those words matter and it gets confusing and lost in language. And then also another thing is because I think motor coordination is such a big part of everybody's life. It's so easy to just mark, oh, you're just a bit clumsy, or you're just such a klutz, and just leave it at that.
Thank you. There's so much more that we could have covered, and maybe we do need to cover more on this. But I just want to say thank you for all the work, all the advocacy work that you do to me, and your presence on social media, and the research that you're doing. The findings that you get from that about that economic cost of dyspraxia, and what it actually costs to be dyspraxic, both to an individual and to the economy itself. So thank you.
You're very welcome, and thank you for having me.
If any of the topics mentioned in today's episode are of special interest to you and you'd like to discuss this further, You can book a one-to-one session with a peer guide on our website at www.autismcentral.nhs.uk. Autism Central would encourage listeners to do their own research and make informed decisions about any strategies or equipment mentioned in this podcast. Any advice or suggestions given by a guest or peer educator do not replace or substitute advice received from direct consultation with a qualified professional. The Autism Central podcast is produced by Autism Central and is the copyright of NHS England.